Hi, Guy and I are going to read to you about postmodernism. And it's really bright outside. Here we go. Section 1. What is truth? It was in 1979, I remember, that my younger brother died, the first person in my family to be tortured. He was 16 years old. The officer opened the meeting. I remember he started by saying that a group of guerrillas they'd caught were about to arrive and that they were going to suffer a little punishment. You realize he doesn't mean an actual mammal gorilla. He means a person. You'll see the punishment they get, and that's for being communists, for being subversive. And if you get mixed up with communists and subversives, you'll get the same treatment. Their faces were monstrously disfigured, unrecognizable. My mother went closer to the lorry, the cart, to see if she could recognize her son. Each of the tortured had different wounds on the face. I mean, their faces all looked different. But my mother recognized her son, my little brother among them. My brother was very badly tortured. He could hardly stand up. All the tortured had no nails, and they had cut off part of the soles of their feet. Anyway, they lined up the tortured and poured petrol on them, and then the soldiers set fire to each one of them. Many of them begged for mercy. They looked half dead when they were lined up there, but when the bodies began to burn, they began to plead for mercy. Some of them screamed. Many of them leapt, but uttered no sound. Thus reads the sickening account of the death of Petrocinio Menchu Tum, Rigoberta Menchu's brother, as Menchu recounted in her autobiography, I, Rigoberta Menchu, an Indian woman in Guatemala. Menchu's compelling narrative won her the 1992 Nobel Peace Prize and made her a hero on all college campuses, where professors used her story to create sympathy for the Marxist guerrillas fighting the United States-backed Guatemalan government. When doctoral student David Stahl went to Guatemala to verify Menchu's story, however, he found much of it to be embellished, far beyond what the facts would support. No villager had any memory of the Guatemalan army carrying out such a slaughter as Menchu described. Menchu later admitted that she had not witnessed such an act. Stahl found many other inaccuracies and untruths, the most serious of which was Menchu's description of how the Guatemalan government's repressive actions led to support of the Marxist guerrillas. Local villagers told Stahl the guerrillas were not viewed as liberators. The people were terrified of them. No one disputes the brutality of the Guatemalan government or its killing of Menchu's family members, but as Kevin J. Kelly commented, United States leftists who give his or Stahl's arguments a full hearing and who have not been deafened by their own dogma will find Stahl's analysis difficult to dismiss. The response from university professors was at once unexpected and utterly predictable. College instructors ordinarily insist on detailed documentation of student papers, and they exact severe penalties for falsehood. But in this case, professors who assigned Menchu's book to their students seemed indifferent or even defensive. Professor Marjorie Agasson of Wellesley College stated bluntly, "Whether her book is true or not, I don't care. We should teach our students about the brutality of the Guatemalan military and the United States financing of it." Timothy Brooke, a Stanford history professor, said the best teaching devices are those which are gently flawed. The ambiguities and nuances are great teaching tools. Beyond the question of whether Menchu's claims have merit lies an enormous question. Is the basis for truth itself being challenged? Are we to point where something is seen as true, not if it is factually correct, but if it communicates powerfully about things people believe? Welcome to postmodernism. Where other worldviews try to orient themselves to what actually exists, postmodernism plays by different rules. Postmodern philosopher Richard Rorty said, We should give up the correspondence theory of truth and start treating moral and scientific beliefs as tools for achieving greater human happiness, rather than as representations of the intrinsic nature of reality. Christians have two contradictory impulses when confronting postmodernism. Some dismiss it as a ridiculous denial of what is obviously true. Others are strangely attracted to it. If truth is just a collection of artifacts giving the impression of truth, then who cares what others say about what we believe? If it seems true to us, then it is true regardless of how valid many other people's criticisms might seem. Myron B. Penner urges Christians not to dismiss the West's cultural and philosophical infatuation with postmodernism. Christians must come to terms with and work through the postmodern turn and its implications for faith, not ignore or retreat from it, he says. At the same time, Penner warns those Christians flirting with postmodernism to be careful, not to get caught up in it to the point where words become emptied of all truth. Let's take both Penner's challenge and his warning seriously by examining postmodernism, peering into the history of its development, grasping its central arguments, discerning whether it is, in fact, a worldview, and discussing what it says about general and special revelation. Section 2. What is postmodernism? Postmodernism means after modernism. But what then is modernism? Modernism is the common name given to the period of time from the 1700s through the 1900s in which assumptions about Christianity in the West, such as belief in the supernatural, a trust in biblical revelation and the authority of the church, gave way to skepticism about religion, an embrace of scientific investigation and technological progress, a trust in human reason, and empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that we can only know what our senses can perceive. Postmodernism is suspicious of science and technology's ability, and religion's ability for that matter, to satisfactorily answer life's ultimate questions. In the end, postmodernism is a worldview that denies all worldviews. Not only does postmodernism strongly critique the secularist idea that science is the most comprehensive way of knowing about the world, it also critiques Christianity, New Spirituality, Islam, and Marxism. The problem, according to postmodernism, is each worldview's claim to offer unbiased truth about the world. Since biased people always communicate worldviews, they say, they are incapable of telling the truth in a way that corresponds to the world as it actually is. Rather, they trick people into looking for universal truths where none can be found. Theologian Kevin Van Hooser points out that C.S. Lewis foresaw the shift toward postmodernist thinking. Lewis's term was Bulverism, after its imaginary inventor Ezekiel Bulver. Van Hooser explains, Lewis imagines the moment that Bulverism was born, when 5-year-old Ezekiel heard his mother say to his father, "Oh, you say that because you are a man." Bulver intuitively grasped the stunning implication. Arguments need not be refuted, only situated. One rebuts a thought simply by calling attention to the genealogy or location of its thinker. Having foreseen this way of forming arguments, probably nothing of what we see in postmodernism today would surprise Lewis. When postmodernists say truth is situated or embedded, they mean that it is impossible to see any issue objectively because we're limited by our experiences in the world. As James K. A. Smith puts it, all of our experience is always already an interpretation. A charitable understanding of this claim, according to R. Scott Smith, is to say that we have the ability to compare our concepts with things as they truly are, and adjust our concepts as needed to fit better with reality. If you have a general concept of a sports car, by learning more about such sports cars, you can fine-tune your concept to the point where you can tell the difference, say, between a Ferrari and a Porsche. But postmodernists usually take it one step further. Our concepts themselves are not objective because our very thoughts about them are affected by thinking them. Some even go so far as to deny that we ever have any direct access to reality at all, that we are only commenting on our comments and thinking about our thinking. Postmodernism is difficult to grasp, but you can understand its basics by contemplating what Van Hooser says are the 7 assumptions on which postmodernism rests, and they're paraphrased here. 1. Postmodernists reject the idea that universal truth can be known. All people can know is whether their individual experiences are true for them. 2. Postmodernists reject reason that applies everywhere at all times. Reasonableness rests on whatever narratives, traditions, institutions, and practices various groups find reasonable. 3. Postmodernists reject that we can be objective in our knowledge. We are all situated in our experiences. 4. Postmodernists reject modernist narratives that try to explain everything in the world and claim universally valid, neutral, objective knowledge. The world is too fragmented and complex to say that any one worldview explains everything. 5. Postmodernists reject the idea of God, or at least our ability to gain a God's eye view of the world. We have to draw meaning out of the world for ourselves. 6. Postmodernists reject the idea that we can design institutions in society that would make objective decisions based on reason. Knowledge about the social order is constructed through the language we use to describe reality to ourselves, and it is biased by its very nature. 7. Postmodernists reject the notion that any person can be neutral. Our cultures, languages, histories, and genders all color how we see the world. In the end, due to our situatedness, postmodernism says no one can have unmediated, direct, or immediate access to reality. You don't see that Ferrari as it actually is. You are only seeing what you interpret of its existence. If you say, "Wow, that's a cool car," all you're doing is talking about your idea of cool. If you say, "Wow, that's a Ferrari F12 Berlinetta," you're not so much identifying the car's essence as placing it in a mental category distinct from all other kinds of cars, and such categories are mainly a commentary on what you think, not what actually exists. Postmodernism has no use for the idea that anything has an identifiable essence. We just see what we see. If postmodernism sounds complicated to you, you're not alone. As we examine previously held ideas about truth, identity, and knowledge, we may be able to see why some people find it so compelling at this point in time. For most of Western history, people not only assumed truth exists, but that those disciplined enough to think well could find it. The postmodern turn, as Myron Penner describes it, says truth is not out there waiting to be discovered. Rather, truth is socially constructed through our interactions with one another, as filtered through our gender identity, where we grow up and our life experiences. We don't so much find truth as construct it. Truth, with a capital T, about reality, is replaced by our own collective little t truths. There's more. If truth can't be known because we have no way to think objectively about it, then attempts to guide people to truth do not actually help us. Instead, they oppress us. Postmodern author Walter Truett Anderson even hesitates to use words like abnormal and deviant in any definitive way because, as he says, those categorizations are under fire now. The boundary between normal and abnormal is as questionable now as are all the other boundaries that once defined social reality. How did we come to the place where we deny capital T truth and boundaries between truth and lies, good and evil? To answer this question, we need to understand a little of postmodernism's history. Section 3, the history of postmodernism. Gorgias taught rhetoric in ancient Greece, making a living by teaching people to be persuasive on behalf of whatever cause they deemed important. What they used persuasion for wasn't important to Gorgias. Effectiveness, not truth, was his aim. Gorgias explained his approach in a book called On Natural or the Non-Existent. While we no longer have the original text, we know the core argument of Gorgias's book went as follows. Nothing exists. Even if something exists, nothing can be known about it. Even if something can be known about it, knowledge about it can't be communicated to others. Even if it can be communicated, it cannot be understood. If Gorgias was right, then both philosophy and communication were pointless. As you can imagine, he was accused of being a nihilist, someone who believes in nothing. But Gorgias did not hold to nihilism. He wasn't saying that the rock you stubbed your toe on didn't actually exist, nor was he saying you couldn't have known it existed or that communicating to someone about it was impossible. Rather, he was pointing out the confusion between what exists and our thoughts about what exists. People only know and communicate about things because they themselves think. So when they tell others what they are thinking, they are communicating what exists or what they are thinking about. So when they tell others what they're thinking, are they communicating what... Try one more time. So when they tell others what they are thinking, are they communicating what exists or what they are thinking about what exists? The uncertain boundary between thought and existence enabled Gorgias to justify teaching people to present themselves as virtuous even if they were not. After all, if our thoughts about virtue don't describe anything real, why would virtuous people have a corner on the virtue market? Historians called Gorgias and his like-minded teachers sophists. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. Sophists thought of themselves as wise. Today, sophism carries a negative connotation. It's the root word for sophistry, by which we mean tricky, manipulative argument. We know about the sophists mostly because of Plato, who wrote a series of dialogues or conversations in which his mentor, Socrates, encountered foolish people and disabused them of their silly philosophies. The sophists always came out looking bad in Plato's dialogues, and his critique of them, put in the mouth of Socrates, made sense to most people for millennia. Truth was objective and knowable. Anyone who disagreed, who said truth was subjective and dependent on the perspective of the person looking at it, was in the minority. In the 1800s, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche helped resurrect sophism. He considered sophism superior to other views about knowledge and communication. According to Nietzsche, every advance in epistemological and moral knowledge has reinstated the sophists. Nietzsche rejected the idea that objective truth can be known, which probably shocked those who knew him in his younger years. His nickname as a boy, after all, had been the Little Pastor, since, according to his sister Elizabeth, he could recite biblical texts and hymns with such feeling that he almost made one cry. Nietzsche himself wrote of his commitment to Christ. He said, "I have firmly resolved within me to dedicate myself forever to his service. May the dear Lord give me strength and power to carry out my intentions and protect me on my life's way." But by age 18, Nietzsche began changing his mind. He wrote, "If we could examine Christian doctrine and church history with a free, unconstrained eye, we would be compelled to arrive at many conclusions which contradict generally accepted ideas." Before long, under the influence of the writings of Ludwig Feuerbach, Nietzsche began seeing gods as human creations. They were nothing more than a projection of our ideas of what is perfect. In his biography of Nietzsche, Julian Young summarized Feuerbach's and Nietzsche's view. Rightly understood, Jesus is not a gateway to another life, but a role model for this one. Many people today sympathize with Nietzsche's shift in thinking. If Jesus was a good teacher but not God, we can embrace the parts of the Bible we like without having to explain or defend the uncomfortable parts. After all, if our claims about reality don't need to be true, just important to us, then a rejection of Christianity as capital T truth is the nicest, most enlightened thing we can do. If Nietzsche's thinking seems radical today, imagine how it appeared to the people of his time. By the time of Nietzsche's writing, modernism was well underway. People believed science would ultimately explain everything. Philosophers thought human reason could be developed to the point where we would no longer need to rely on special revelation to understand the world. But Nietzsche saw past this pretension to a time when anything we relied on for certainty would break down. Are we brave enough to face such a world? Eventually, Nietzsche abandoned any notion of Christianity's value, though he knew chaos would result if people tried to live according to what he said. The most famous passage of his writing, in which a madman confronts his fellow citizens about God's death, is both honest and tragic. And this is what it says. This is from a book. "Whither is God? I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, and in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as though in infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decomposed. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him." By this statement, Nietzsche did not mean to imply God was once alive and had died. He was assuming belief in God to be unnecessary, and that only our belief in God kept him alive, while encouraging the reader to get busy dealing with the implications of this fact. If it had not been for people's growing cynicism about the ability of science and technology to solve all of our problems, Nietzsche's ideas might not have emerged as so important. As it was, his thinking profoundly influenced an entire generation of philosophers, among them Michel Foucault, a famous, influential, if personally troubled, 20th century intellect. In 1948, as a young university student, Foucault attempted suicide. The resident doctor at the elite Parisian university where he was studying, l'École Normale Supérieure, I don't know French, so that's really bad interpretation of it. Anyway, the doctor concluded that Foucault was racked with guilt over his frequent nocturnal visits to the illegal gay bars of the French capital. Foucault's father, a strict disciplinarian who had previously sent his son to the most regimented Catholic school he could find, arranged for him to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. After his release, Foucault remained obsessed with death. He often joked about hanging himself and made further attempts to end his own life. Foucault's youthful experiences with homosexuality, attempted suicide, and mental imbalance proved decisive for his intellectual development. His philosophy became a way of coping with his own rejection of absolute truth, as well as a crusade to liberate humanity from labeling, marginalization, and suppression. Before his death from AIDS, which he contracted through anonymous gay sex, Foucault turned the world of philosophy upside down with books like Madness and Civilization, The Birth of the Clinic, Discipline and Punish, and The History of Sexuality. Apparently, Foucault saw himself as trapped in a cycle of the death of societal truths, a cycle first revealed by his hero, Nietzsche. And this is what he writes in one of his books. Nietzsche indicated the turning point from a long way off. It is not so much the absence or the death of God that is affirmed as the end of man. It becomes apparent then that the death of God and the last man are engaged in a contest with more than one round. Is it not the last man who announces that he has killed God, thus situating his language, his thought, his laughter in the space of that already dead God, yet positing himself also as he who has killed God and whose existence includes the freedom and the decision of that murder? Thus, the last man is at the same time older and yet younger than the death of God, since he has killed God. It is he himself who must answer for his own finitude, but since it is in the death of God that he speaks, thinks, and exists, his murder itself is doomed to die. New gods, the same gods, are already swelling the future ocean. Man will disappear. Foucault placed his finger on the carotid artery of modernism and found it to be as cold a corpse as Nietzsche's God. God was dead. Modernism attempted to enthrone humanity in its place, but everything important was slaughtered along with God. No one was left to be crowned. This sounds morbid, to be sure, and it is admittedly difficult to condense 2,000 years of philosophical history into a few sentences. But the key takeaway remains. Philosophy today operates on what Paul Ricoeur called a hermeneutic of suspicion. Our interpretation of everything in society should express doubt about all truth claims. Postmodernism cannot allow for thoughts and things to have any firmly knowable meaning aside from our interpretation. As Daniel Dennett understands, if things had real intrinsic essences, they could have real intrinsic meanings, and that is simply unacceptable. I'm going to stop there for a minute.